Nobel Prize winners. All right, buckle up. Dear dreamer, tonight, we're starting a new series. We're going to be riding shotgun through the lives of Nobel laureates, geniuses, rebels, peacebringers, and chaos tamers. We've got over 1,000 extraordinary biographies to go through. So, we're going to be here a while. But before we dive into the brilliance and the backstories, we need to zoom out, because this whole show, this worldwide obsession with gold medals and black tie speeches, it didn't fall from the sky. It was sparked by one man. And ironically, that spark came from someone who literally made things go boom. Let's tackle the story of how Alfred Nobel, the dude famous for inventing dynamite, ended up gifting the world a prestigious array of prizes and rewriting his legacy from merchant of death to champion of humankind. Picture a brilliant tinkerer with a conscience, an ill-fated obituary, a legal labyrinth, and a global cultural juggernaut. Let's get rolling. Born in Stockholm on October 21st, 1833, Alfred Bernhard Nobel was the fourth son in a family of engineers and inventors. His father, Emanuel Nobel, flopped spectacularly in business in Sweden and then relocated to St. Petersburg to build armaments factories. Young Alfred was homeschooled, multilingual, and exposed early to explosives and experimentation. After a stint traveling and studying across Europe and the US, Alfred dove into nitroglycerin research, eventually inventing dynamite in 1867 by stabilizing it into safer forms. That invention plus later creations like gelignite 1875 and ballistite 1887 made him fabulously wealthy and feared in equal measure. In 1888, a French newspaper accidentally published Alfred's obituary instead of his brother's, calling him the merchant of death for profiting off explosives. Nobel read this and reportedly recoiled at the idea of being remembered for destruction rather than creation. The legend says this error inspired him toward constructing a more positive legacy. You might think explosive magnate equals emotionless. But Nobel was apparently a literary soul who wrote verse and plays. Most unpublished or later destroyed. He kept quiet. But friends insist he was deeply affected by his own inventions and obsessed with leaving something better behind. And he counted Bertha von Suttner, a peace activist and confidant, as a major influence on his humanitarian outlook. By late 1895 in Paris at the Swedish-Norwegian Club, Nobel scribbles the final version of the will that would detonate into global significance. He bequeathed 94% of his fortune, 31 million Swedish kronor, to fund annual prizes in 5 areas: physics, chemistry, physiology or medicine, literature, and peace, all to honor those who have conferred the greatest benefit to humankind. Cue jaw-dropping during the will reading. His family and world leaders were shocked that Nobel had essentially locked them out, dedicating his massive wealth to a grand experiment in recognition and philanthropy. After Nobel died in San Remo, Italy on December 10, 1896, the world was awash with questions. Who executes the will? How are these prizes administered? A nasty fight erupted both with Nobel's heirs and over jurisdiction. By April 1897, Norway's parliament, the Storting, formally accepted responsibility for the Peace Prize. Sweden took charge of the scientific, literary, and medical prizes. In June 1900, the Nobel Foundation, a private organization in Stockholm, was formally established to manage the endowment, investments, and administrative machinery behind the prizes. Exactly 5 years after Nobel's death on December 10, 1901, the first ever Nobel Prizes were awarded in Stockholm and Oslo for peace. Thus dawned a new era where a gold-plated medal, a diploma, and roughly 11 million Swedish kronor, today's prize amount, which is equivalent to approximately 1,35,000 became shorthand for global recognition. Here's why the prizes took off. The cash payout was substantial. Early prizes equaled about 20 years of an academic salary, making them radically impactful for recipients and raising public awareness of scientific breakthroughs. The selection process involved anonymous nominations from the international community, followed by vetting by secretive committees in Sweden for science literature or Norway for peace. Nomination archives remain sealed for 50 years. So room for brutal honesty behind closed doors. The committees purposely waited years before awarding prizes to assess long-term impact, ensuring enduring value rather than succumbing to hype. That approach cemented the Nobel's reputation for sagacious choices. Fast forward to 1968. Sweden's central bank's Riksbank establishes a sixth prize, formerly known as the Prize in Economic Sciences, in memory of Alfred Nobel, first awarded in 1969. Though not from Nobel's original will, it fits the mold and is now treated as part of the Nobel family. No venerable institution survives without controversy. The Nobel Prize is no exception. In 1926, George Bernard Shaw famously said, "I can forgive Nobel for inventing dynamite, but only a fiend in human form could have invented the Nobel Prize." He initially declined the winnings, then changed his mind, but refused the money and requested it be used to translate works by the Swedish playwright August Strindberg. Boris Pasternak Literature 1958 was forced to decline by the Soviet Union, only accepted posthumously through his son decades later. Frederick Banting Medicine 1923 shared the award with John Mlaud, but Banting believed Charles Best deserved it. He gave half his money to Best and Mlaud split his portion with Collip. This messy credit drama still stings. In 1952, Albert Schatz, who actually isolated streptom under Selman Waxman, was left out of the prize, reflecting hierarchical bias towards senior professors at the time. These missteps show the human frailty behind the myth, but thankfully rare considering the global prestige at stake. As of 2024, over 627 Nobel Prizes had been awarded to 102 individuals and organizations, including titans like Einstein, Marie Curie, Mandela, Malala, and dozens more. The awards now span 6 categories, remain held every December 10th, and include lavish ceremonies in Stockholm and Oslo, complete with secret gala menus and high-security pomp. Despite efforts, awards still skew heavily male and Eurocentric. Only 65 women in total have been awarded the Nobel Prize between 1901 and 2024. Literature and peace awards in particular remain hotbeds of geopolitical controversy. From toxic explosions to glowing accolades, the Nobel Prize story is a whirlwind of invention, public relations, genius, philanthropy, and institutional evolution. Nobel's transformation from a figure associated with mass destruction to a namesake attached to humanity's loftiest ideals is nothing short of poetic irony. It took misreported death notices, legal sparring, international committees, secret nominations, and recurring controversies, but it gave the world an annual moment to pause and reflect on real progress. So, there it is. The story of how a bomb guy became the beloved architect of the world's most respected prizes. This prize hasn't been perfect. It's carried its fair share of controversy and, yes, plenty of inequality. Still, it's worth sharing the stories of those who gave everything chasing the highest good. Not for gold medals or black tie ceremonies, but because they believed in something bigger than themselves. They burned the midnight oil in labs. They poured their souls into pages. They fought for peace when the world was falling apart. These weren't people chasing prizes. The prizes chased them. So, let's honor that. Let's bring the laureates into the light of peace, of literature, of medicine, of chemistry. Let's invite them to the stage one by one, year by year, field by field, and let's tell their stories the way they deserve to be told. I mean, I'll try my best. Frederick Pacey, the peace prophet with a penchant for pedantry. Frederick Pacey, the man, the myth, the monal. All right, he may not have worn a monal, though, let's be honest, he should have. Born in 1822, smack dab in the chaotic aftermath of Napoleon's glory days, Pacey arrived on the scene just in time to watch France bounce between monarchies and republics like a caffeinated squirrel on a trampoline. Perfect breeding ground for a future peace activist. Don't you think? From the very start, Pacey was marinated in privilege. He was born into a well-connected bourgeois Parisian family. Daddy Pacey had fought at Waterloo, a detail that always makes you wonder whether Frederick's pacifism was some sort of elaborate family rebellion. Instead of going down the usual route of soldiering, politicking, or extravagant loafing, young Frederick took the road less traveled. Economics. That's right. Our boy chose charts over cavalry charges. He started out studying law because that's what you do when you're a Frenchman with a legacy to uphold. But bureaucracy bored him, and in 1846, at the tender age of 24, he said no to a safe government career and took a bold leap into economic writing. Yes, writing about trade tariffs and national debt was his version of rebellion. Rock and roll had not yet been invented. Early on, Pacey was heavily influenced by British free traders like Richard Cobden and John Bright. These men believed, as did Pacey, that if nations traded freely, they'd have no reason to shoot each other. It was a romantic idea, the kind of economics you wish worked in real life instead of just sounding nice in treaties. Then came the Crimean War 1853 to 1856. While most people were waving flags and sharpening bayonets, Pacey looked around and said, "Wait, are we seriously doing this again?" This war, like many before it, seemed to him the product of ignorance, bad diplomacy, and economic idiocy, and so began his lifelong mission: replace war with reason, arbitration, and economic cooperation. Yes, he was basically trying to turn the United Nations into a dinner party. In 1867, as France and Prussia began the usual chest thumping over Luxembourg because apparently there weren't enough bigger problems, Pacey launched a campaign of public letters urging diplomacy over aggression. The public was mildly interested. The government was not. Still, Pacey pushed on, and the following year, he founded the Ligue Internationale, a permanent de law. If you're wondering how many wars that league prevented, well, 0. But to be fair, the Franco-Russian War started 3 years later. So the guy was working under pressure. After the war in 1871, he regrouped and launched the Société Française d'Armée de l'Eau because apparently the key to world peace is launching enough clubs. Pacey remained undeterred by the repeated explosions of violence around him. Instead, he kept churning out articles, essays, speeches, and news societies, all in the name of arbitration. But Pacey wasn't just shouting into the void. In 1881, he got himself elected to the Chamber of Deputies, the French Parliament. There he did what most politicians fear. He stayed consistent. He opposed colonialism sacrilege in 1880s. France pushed for labor protections and insisted that France adopt arbitration treaties instead of war budgets. Some applauded him. Others rolled their eyes so hard they saw their ancestors. In 1888, a curious development occurred. A British MP named William Randall Cramer came to Paris and sat down with Pacey. Together, they had the absurd idea that maybe, just maybe, national representatives from across Europe could get together and talk instead of shoot. Thus, in 1889, the first interparliamentary conference was held in Paris, bringing together legislators from around Europe. The Interparliamentary Union IPU was born, and Pi became its first president. The man who once wrote pamphlets from his study was now organizing continental conferences. Pacey spent the next 2 decades writing, speaking, and teaching, always with the same message. War is dumb. Arbitration is smart. And everyone should calm the hell down. He even developed educational materials for children, believing peace could be taught, like math or hygiene. His Peace Through Education initiative included textbooks, teacher guides, and even school competitions. Think of it as Model UN for 19th century French kids. He was nominated for the very first Nobel Peace Prize in 1901, and he won it jointly with Swiss humanitarian Henry Dunant, the founder of the Red Cross, where Dunant brought aid to the battlefield. Pacey had tried to erase the battlefield itself. The split prize was fitting. One rewarded healing the wounds of war, the other preventing them. When the press speculated that another candidate might challenge Pacey to a duel for winning, Pacey reportedly laughed. Dueling over a peace prize would have been ironic enough to send him into orbit. Even into old age, Pacey kept advocating. In 1905, during a heated standoff between Norway and Sweden, Pacey commended the countries for settling their dispute peacefully. He said he was 100 times more delighted by their peaceful resolution than he had been by receiving the Nobel Prize. That was classic Pacey. Always more excited by people getting along than by personal accolades. He died in 1912 at the age of 90. Just 2 years before the world would explode into the First World War. An event that likely would have given him a stroke even if old age hadn't gotten there first. But his work endured. The IPU continued. Peace organizations carried on his mission. And the Nobel Peace Prize became the most prestigious recognition for the kind of work he championed. Pacey wasn't perfect. He could be preachy. He sometimes sounded like a sanctimonious dinner guest who wouldn't shut up about trade balances. But he was also sincere, tireless, and unshakably principled. He believed in the power of reason over rage, dialogue over destruction, and in a century soaked in blood. That belief was revolutionary. So there you have it. Frederick Perry, economist, idealist, parliamentarian, pamphlet, founder of peace leagues, creator of the IPU, and winner of the very first Nobel Peace Prize. The man who tried to argue the world into sanity. Henry Dunant, the accidental angel with a killer beard. Now, dear dreamer, we turn to a man whose life sounds like a biblical parable ghost written by a war correspondent with a flair for melodrama. Let me introduce you to Henry Dunant, Swiss businessman, hopeless idealist, absolute disaster of a financier, and the man who accidentally invented humanitarianism while running extremely late to a meeting. Born in Geneva in 1828, Dunant came from a wealthy Calvinist family that was so charitable they probably hosted dinner parties where the main course was virtue. His parents made philanthropy look like a competitive sport. The young Henry spent his teenage years founding Christian youth clubs and helping the poor. But don't let the saintly resume fool you. This guy would eventually end up bankrupt, disowned, and living in a one-room hospice. But we'll get there. Young Henry dabbled in banking and colonial interests, and by his late 20s, he was a globe-trotting businessman angling to secure land and water rights in French-controlled Algeria, which is how in June of 1859, he found himself in northern Italy near the town of Solferino. He wasn't there for sightseeing. He was trying to chase down Napoleon III to ask for support for his business venture. Classic do not move. Barge into a battlefield to hand someone a business proposal. Except Solferino was in the middle of a war. On June 24th, the Austrians and the Franco-Sardinian alliance decided to paint the fields red with the blood of 40,000 soldiers in a single day. Dunn arrived just after the carnage and was, in a word, horrified. There were tens of thousands of wounded and dying men lying in the sun, most of them untreated, moaning for water or mercy or both. Local civilians were trying to help, but there was no organized system. It was a humanitarian disaster with extra blood. Now, Most of us would take one look at that mess, say yikes, and find the nearest exit. Not do not. He dove in. He organized volunteers, begged doctors to help regardless of nationality, distributed supplies, and generally turned himself into the Mother Teresa of Lombardy. His rallying cry became Tutti Fratelli. We're all brothers. If he'd had a TikTok, it would have gone viral. When he returned to Geneva, he wrote it all down in a slim punch to the gut book called A Memory of Solferino. It was published in 1862 and read like an eyewitness account of hell with a side order of righteous fury. It did not, however, include any updates on his failed Algerian business venture, which had gone up in flames while he was busy saving lives. Priorities. Right. The book was a sensation. Called for two things: a permanent relief organization to care for wounded soldiers regardless of nationality, and an international agreement to protect medics and the wounded during war. Radical. Right. But apparently people were into it. A committee formed in Geneva in 1863, including Junel and 4 other Swiss men to make his idea a reality. This was the birth of the International Committee of the Red Cross. Now, let's be clear. Junel was the heart and soul of the Red Cross. He had the vision, the charisma, and the publicity instincts of a 19th century influencer. But he was also, shall we say, not the most financially responsible man. While the Red Cross was gathering steam, Dunn's business empire was sinking faster than his reputation at a shareholders' meeting. By 1867, he was declared bankrupt, publicly humiliated, and expelled from the Red Cross Committee by his own colleagues, who were increasingly uncomfortable with being linked to a man whose balance sheets looked like battlefield triage reports. To add insult to injury, he was also kicked out of the Geneva Society for Public Welfare and exiled from polite society. His family disowned him. He wandered Europe in obscurity, living in cheap lodgings, depending on friends and charity, and watching as the organization he founded grew into a global juggernaut without him. Still, Henry didn't stay silent. He wrote, spoke, ranted, pleaded. He supported the idea of international law protecting civilians and prisoners of war. He agitated for peace, women's rights, the abolition of slavery, anything that smacked of basic human decency. He just didn't have the clout or the cash to get people to listen anymore. For decades, he lived in near anonymity. And then, plot twist, in the 1890s, a journalist rediscovered Junel living in a hospice in Haydn, Switzerland. The article went viral by 19th century standards, and suddenly the world remembered him. He began receiving letters, visitors, even a small pension. And in 1901, when the first Nobel Peace Prize was awarded, it went to 2 people: Frederick Pacey, the lecture-loving pacifist from Chapter 1, and Henry Dunal, the broken, aging founder of the Red Cross. Dunal accepted the award, but refused to attend the ceremony. He spent his last years alone, yet again, poor, in the same hospice in Haydn, railing against war and injustice until his final breath. He died in 1910 at the age of 82 with barely more than a Bible and a medal to his name. The Red Cross, of course, went on to become the world's most recognized humanitarian organization. June's ideas were codified in the Geneva Conventions, and every time an ambulance zips through a war zone, you can thank the idealistic businessman who couldn't sit still after seeing too much suffering. So yes, Henry Dunal was messy. He was dramatic. He was infuriating. But he was also brilliant, brave, and far ahead of his time. The man failed as a businessman, but succeeded as a human being. He tried to make war a little less barbaric, and in doing so, changed the rules of war forever. Raise a glass or a bandage to Henry Dunal, the accidental angel of Solferino, Sully Prud, and the poetic Nobel Prize plot twist no one saw coming. Sully Prudhomme. The name alone sounds like it should belong to a wine critic or a particularly well-dressed detective in a Parisian noir. But no. Sully was a poet. A very serious, very French poet. And in 1901, when the Nobel Committee handed out the very first Nobel Prize for Literature, they gave it to this man. Not Tolstoy, not Ibsen, not Zola. They gave it to a dude who spent most of his time writing about metaphysics and melancholy. Let that sink in. The inaugural Literature Nobel went to a guy who wrote about the soul of things literally, and the literary world lost its mind. But let's back up. Sully Prudhomme was born René François Armand Prudhomme on March 16, 1839 in Paris. You know, back when revolutions came with baguettes and barricades. His father died when he was just a kid, and his early life was modest. He studied at the Les Bonaparte and originally aimed to be an engineer. Yes, really. France could have had another Gustave Eiffel. But fate and a persistent eye condition had other plans. He switched to studying law, then got bored of law. Who doesn't? And finally, like a true existentialist in the making, fell into poetry. He joined the literary salons of Paris and started publishing in the 1860s. His first collection, STEs, a poem 1865, was a hit with the kind of people who read poetry for sport. He wasn't flashy or political. He wasn't scandalous or satirical. Sully was precise, melancholic, almost mathematical in his metaphors. He was the kind of poet who wanted to explain the universe using a sigh and a semicolon. Now, during this time, French poetry was crawling with wild children. The symbolists, the decadents, the romantics, all trying to out-weird each other. But Sully, he kept it dignified. Think of him as the guy at the party who sips absinthe but insists on reciting Horace in Latin. His breakout poem, Lova's Breeze, The Broken Vase, became a symbol of fragile human emotion. A sentimental object lesson in poetic form. It described how even a small crack left unhealed can eventually destroy something beautiful. It's about love or trauma, or maybe crockery, depends on your level of heartbreak. The Franco-Russian War 1870–71 shook Prudhomme deeply. He served in the National Guard during the Siege of Paris, and after the war his poetry turned increasingly philosophical. He began exploring science, morality, the human condition, all with the emotional restraint of a man trying not to spill red wine on a white tablecloth. In 1878, he published Liszt, a long, dense philosophical poem that read like a courtroom drama between reason and emotion. He was elected to the Académie Française in 1881, the French Literary Hall of Fame, and took his seat among men in powdered wigs. Metaphorically, at least. He became known not just as a poet, but as a poet who thought poetry should elevate the soul, not just decorate it. While others wrote about lovers and opium, Prudhomme wrote about atoms, logic, and the moral compass. So when Alfred Nobel died and left his fortune to establish prizes for human achievement, his will said the Literature Prize should go to the most outstanding work in an ideal direction. Cue chaos, because no one could agree on what ideal direction meant. World-changing, morally uplifting, spiritually moving, basically not Tolstoy. The Swedish Academy made its pick in 1901, and voila. Sully Prudhomme. The backlash was immediate. People screamed for Leo Tolstoy. Even Tolstoy was confused. But the committee defended their choice. Prudhomme represented the idealistic intellectual tradition of European poetry. He wasn't a firebrand. He wasn't controversial. He was elegant, cerebral, and emotionally subtle. Prudhomme, for his part, accepted with grace. He used a good chunk of the prize money to establish a poetry fund with the Académie Française to support young poets. He basically turned around and said, "Thanks for the cash. Now, let's help the kids. Say what you want." The man had class. But behind the calm exterior, he wasn't well. Prudhomme suffered from health issues for years. His eyesight had been a problem since youth. and later in life he was frail and largely confined to his home. His final works veered into abstract territory, more philosophical musings than traditional verse. He was in many ways trying to write his way into the metaphysical beyond. He died on September 7, 1907 in Shetton, Malibri, quietly without drama. No scandals. No public fallouts. Just a bookshelf full of carefully crafted verses. A Nobel medal. And a legacy built not on shock but on sincerity. So why does Proudhon matter? Because he was the first writer to be crowned by a prize that would later celebrate Hemingway, Morrison, Neruda, and Dylan. Don't get me started. He represented a moment in time when the Nobel Prize thought literature should be a guiding light, not a roaring fire. He was mocked, misremembered, and eventually overshadowed. But in 1901, Sully Proudhon was the man of the hour, the quiet laureate, the poetic plot twist. Rest well, dear dreamer, and please handle all emotional VS with care. Emile von Behring, the antitoxin alchemist who fought death with a syringe. All right, my darling dreamer, settle in. We turn our microscope toward a man who didn't just battle disease. He punched it square in the proteins. Emile von Behring, the first ever Nobel Prize winner in physiology or medicine, is perhaps the least romantic of the early laureates. No brooding poetry, no peace rallies, no metaphysical metaphors about vases, just science syringes and one seriously heroic immune system. Born on March 15, 1854 in Hansdorf in what is now Poland. Emil Adolf Behring was the son of a schoolmaster. He was the eldest of 13 children, which is probably how he developed a high tolerance for chaos and noise, both of which would later define his laboratory. The family was poor and Behring had to claw his way into education. He attended gymnasium in Hohenstein and in 1874, with no money for a traditional university, he enrolled at the Prussian Military Medical Institute in Berlin. The tuition was free, but the price was military service. There he trained to become an army doctor, while other students flirted with romantic poetry and jewels. Behring was busy learning how to stitch wounds and dodge bureaucracy. After qualifying, he served in various military hospitals, gaining first-hand experience with the ravages of infectious diseases among soldiers. It was gritty, unglamorous work, but it planted the seeds of a question that would define his life. Why were we still letting microscopic monsters run the world? In the 1880s, Behring managed to land a research post at the University of Berlin under the legendary Robert Koch, who had already isolated the bacteria responsible for anthrax and tuberculosis. If Behring had a scientific awakening, this was it. He was now part of a circle of bacteriological heavyweights, and he quickly proved that he wasn't just another face in the petri dish. Behring began experimenting with blood serum, that golden liquid left behind after blood clots, as a means of transferring immunity. He theorized that injecting serum from an immunized animal into a sick one could neutralize certain diseases, in an era where magic was still a serious medical theory in some quarters. This was revolutionary. In 1890, he and Japanese scientist Shibasaburo Kitasato made a landmark breakthrough. Serum from animals immunized against tetanus could successfully treat and prevent the disease in others. They quickly expanded their research to diphtheria, a horrifying illness that killed thousands of children by essentially choking them from the inside. Behring worked like a man possessed, often sleeping in his lab, sometimes forgetting to eat. When his serum showed success in animal trials, he pushed for human testing. Ethical oversight was, let's say, still developing, but his treatment saved lives. Period. By 1894, Behring's diphtheria antitoxin was being produced on a broad scale, first in Germany and soon across Europe and the United States. Clinics reported that mortality rates among children with diphtheria dropped from over 50% to under 15%. In the grim world of pediatric wards, this was a miracle. People called him the savior of children. And for once, the hype wasn't overblown. He was rewarded with money, fame, a professorship at the University of Marburg, and eventually a Nobel title. He was honored with Prussian nobility in 1901, henceforth being known by the surname von Behring. He built an institute in Marburg that turned into a serum production powerhouse employing dozens of researchers and scientists. He also founded Behring Werke, a pharmaceutical company dedicated to serum production. Today, it would be the equivalent of a biotech unicorn, minus the casual hoodies and ping-pong tables. But Behring wasn't just a benevolent germ fighter. He was also ambitious, sometimes ruthless, and definitely difficult to work with. He frequently clashed with fellow scientists. He had a notorious feud with Paul Ehrlich over the development and refinement of the diphtheria antitoxin. Behring believed he was the true pioneer. Ehrlich, never one to back down, thought otherwise. Letters flew. Accusations buzzed. The Nobel Committee wisely gave Behring the solo spotlight in 1901, perhaps hoping to avoid a duel at the awards ceremony. Speaking of the Nobel Prize, when Alfred Nobel laid out his will, stating that the prizes should reward those who conferred the greatest benefit to mankind, Behring's name must have practically leapt off the short list. He didn't just talk about saving lives. He had actual data, actual children who lived to grow up thanks to a needle and some horse serum. It was no contest, but success did not soften him. Behring remained a stern taskmaster in his lab, often dismissing students and collaborators who didn't meet his impossibly high standards. He lived in a castle-like home near Marburg, funded by his considerable earnings. There he hosted elite guests and dictated the pace of vaccine development like a scientific emperor. Yet despite the grandeur, he remained deeply engaged in research, publishing papers until his final years. Behring's later work focused on tuberculosis, the white plague of Europe. He believed he could use a similar serum-based approach to tame the disease. He called his new concoction tuberculin R and poured resources into its development. The results were mixed at best, and critics accused him of promoting a treatment without adequate evidence. It didn't tarnish his legacy, but it did show that even the greats can fall prey to their own hype. He died on March 31, 1917 in Marburg, just as World War I was tearing Europe apart, while others were marching to war. He had spent his life fighting microscopic enemies far more deadly than any soldier. His institute continued his work, and the name von Behring became synonymous with immunology and vaccine science. Today he is remembered not only as the founder of serum therapy but also as a pioneer of preventative medicine. Long before the polio vaccine or mRNA, there was Behring hunched over a microscope figuring out how to bottle immunity. So yes, Emil von Behring was no romantic laureate. He didn't write odes or found peace movements. But he took on death with science and walked away with a Nobel Prize and millions of lives saved. Jacobus Henricus Vanto, the chemical dreamer who took molecules personally. Chemistry, the subject that broke more students than calculus and Latin combined. But behind every confusing exam and every ill-timed classroom explosion stands a genius who once asked, "What if atoms had feelings?" Enter Jacobus Henricus van 't Hooft, the man who turned chemical equations into poetry and won the very first Nobel Prize in chemistry in 1901. Born on August 30th, 1852 in Rotterdam, Netherlands, Vanto was the son of a medical doctor. As a child, he was the kind of kid who doodled crystals in the margins of his math notebook and spent more time outdoors than indoors, dreaming of becoming a poet or an explorer. Unfortunately for the world of verse, but very fortunately for science, his father insisted on a more respectable path. Engineering or medicine. Van 't Hooft dutifully enrolled in the Polytechnic School in Delft to study engineering. But his heart was never in it. He was smuggling chemistry books into his dorm like forbidden romances. By the time he reached the University of Leiden, his obsession with chemistry was in full bloom. He was especially intrigued by the way molecules moved and arranged themselves as if they had secret social lives. In Paris, he studied under Charles Adolphe Wurtz, who was influential in organic chemistry. In Bonn, he met Friedrich Kuhl, famous for his benzene ring dream. These mentors helped shape Van Hoff's imagination into something rigorous, if still a little dreamy. Now, let's talk about 1874. This was the year Van Hoff, all of 22 years old and still considered something of a flaky dreamer, published a paper proposing that the carbon atom wasn't flat, that it actually had a three-dimensional tetrahedral shape when bonded to four other atoms. Boom! It was like someone added a Xaxes to chemistry. His idea explained why certain molecules twisted one way but not the other, and it laid the groundwork for stereochemistry. The response: crickets, or worse, mockery. One chemistry journal editor dismissed his idea as the fanciful musings of a poet masquerading as a scientist. But as it turns out, Van Hoff was right, and the rest of the chemical world would spend the next few decades catching up. After earning his doctorate from Utrecht University in 1874, Van Hoff held several academic posts, including a professorship in Amsterdam. He continued pushing boundaries with his unorthodox theories. In the 1880s, he made major contributions to chemical kinetics and equilibrium, showing that reaction rates and equilibrium constants could be explained mathematically. He was giving order to chaos, taming the wild reactions of the laboratory like a molecular lion tamer. Then came his pioneering work in osmotic pressure, a concept so dry it sounds like it belongs in a plumbing manual. But Van Hoff turned it into magic. He showed that the behavior of dissolved substances could be predicted using gas laws. He basically bridged the world of chemistry and physics with a single formula, and in doing so helped birth modern physical chemistry. By 1901, when the Nobel Prizes were launched, Van Hoff was already a rocker in the chemical community. His book studies in chemical dynamics and his work on dilute solutions had revolutionized the way chemists understood matter on a molecular level. The Nobel Committee didn't hesitate. They awarded him the first chemistry prize for discovery of the laws of chemical dynamics and osmotic pressure in solutions. Van Hoff accepted with the calm of someone who had spent decades being called both a genius and a fool. He wasn't flashy. He wasn't political. He didn't give rousing speeches. But he understood the fundamental language of molecules like few ever have. To him, chemistry wasn't just about mixing things in flasks. It was about patterns, shapes, and the invisible dance of atoms. In 1905, he moved to Berlin to join the Prussian Academy of Sciences. There he focused on geology and the application of chemistry to natural formations. He was still trying to understand how the tiniest components of matter shaped the grandest forms of the earth. He once described his work as the search for simplicity and complexity, which honestly could be printed on every scientist's business card. But not even Nobel laureates live forever. Van Hoff died in 1911 at the age of 58 after a brief illness. He left behind equations, concepts, and a changed field. The once dismissed dreamer had become the foundation of stereochemistry and physical chemistry. So the next time you stare blankly at a diagram of a molecule and wonder why you ever signed up for chemistry, just remember some of those shapes exist because Van Hoff believed that atoms didn't like being flat. He saw depth where others saw surface. He turned the abstract into something you could visualize, feel, almost touch. Jacobus Henricus van Hoff, the poet laureate of molecules. Wilhelm Roonen, the accidental X-man who saw through us all. Wilhelm Conrad Ronen, the man who gave the world the power to see inside itself without so much as a scalpel. He wasn't trying to be a medical hero or the toast of physics. He just happened to stumble into the invisible and came out of his lab holding a ghostly picture of his wife's hand. Romantic. A little creepy. Extremely revolutionary. Absolutely. Born on March 27, 1845 in Lennep, a small town in the Prussian Rhe province. Runin grew up in the kind of proper disciplined environment that churned out engineers and civil servants by the dozen. His father was a cloth merchant. His mother of Dutch descent. The family moved to Apeldoorn in the Netherlands when Wilhelm was still young, and he began attending school there. And here's where it gets fun. Rengun, the future Nobel Prize winner, was expelled from high school. The reason he refused to name the classmate responsible for a cartoon of their teacher. Yes, the man who discovered X-rays once got the boot for having a spine. He spent time in various technical and preparatory schools before finally landing at the Federal Polytechnic Institute in Zurich. There he studied mechanical engineering and was quickly recognized for his meticulous mind and tireless curiosity. He earned his doctorate in 1869 under the supervision of August Kunt and continued working with him as an assistant at the universities of Würzburg and Strasbourg. Despite these achievements, Renan wasn't a household name in the scientific community. He was regarded as diligent, competent, methodical, but not flashy, not radical. He was the kind of guy who would quietly work late hours in the lab tweaking equipment while others wrote manifestos. His career progressed slowly but steadily. He held posts at Hohenheim, Strasbourg, Gien, and finally in 1888 the University of Würzburg, where he became a full professor and director of the Physics Institute. It was here in a modest lab surrounded by thick lead screens and vacuum tubes that history crept up behind him. In the fall of 1895, Rankine was experimenting with cathode ray tubes, glass vacuum tubes with electrodes at either end designed to produce high-voltage discharges. His particular interest was in the behavior of these rays in sealed tubes wrapped in black cardboard. The evening of November 8th, he noticed a peculiar glow emanating from a fluorescent screen coated in beryllium platinocyanide. Even though it was several feet from the tube and shielded from light, he had no idea what was causing it. That's when he did something beautifully old school. He began to investigate. For weeks, Röntgen worked in secret, living almost nocturnally in his lab, chasing down the mystery of these invisible rays. He tested how they interacted with different materials: metal, wood, glass, flesh. He found that while they could pass through soft tissue, they were blocked by denser substances like bone and lead, and they could imprint images on photographic plates. He called them X-rays to denote their unknown nature. On December 22, 1895, he took the now famous image of his wife Anna Bertha Ludwig's hand. The photo showed her bones in stark contrast, her wedding ring appearing as a white circle. When she saw the image, she was horrified. "I have seen my death," she reportedly said. It was the first human X-ray ever taken, and it chilled and fascinated the world in equal measure. In January 1896, Runin published his paper on a new kind of rays, and within weeks, scientists across Europe and America were replicating his findings. The practical applications became apparent almost immediately. Surgeons began using X-rays to locate bullets, fractures, and foreign objects inside the body. Dentists peered into jawbones. Physicists went wild. Public fascination exploded, with newspapers running X-ray images and speculative illustrations of future X-ray glasses that could see through walls. It was a revolution, and Renan, the quiet man in the lab coat, was suddenly famous. Yet fame didn't change him. He refused to patent the discovery, believing it belonged to humanity. He declined opportunities to capitalize on his new celebrity. When he was awarded the first Nobel Prize in Physics in 1901, the committee cited his work as epoch-making. He accepted the prize money but donated most of it to the University of Würzburg. Still, not everything about X-rays was immediately understood. The long-term effects of radiation exposure weren't known. and early adopters paid a price. Burns, radiation sickness, and eventual cancers became tragically common among pioneers in radiography. Roonin himself was cautious, often shielding his hands and limiting exposure. But even he was not immune to the risks. In 1900, he left Würzburg for a position at the University of Munich, where he continued teaching and performing research, though he never again produced work as world-shaking as his discovery of X-rays. He remained a private man, avoiding the limelight and declining to have institutions named after him. Even when he was offered a Nobel title, he politely refused. World War I hit Rankin hard. He lost much of his savings due to the inflation and economic turmoil of post-war Germany. His wife Anna died in 1919 and Roonin himself succumbed to intestinal cancer in 1923 at the age of 77. He died nearly penniless. His legacy scattered across hospital walls and radiology labs around the globe. Today his name lives on in the term röntgen ray, still used in parts of the world to describe X-rays. The unit run is a measure of radiation exposure. His invention became the backbone of diagnostic medicine, opening up new realms of research and forever changing how we look at the human body. So let us raise a metaphorical glass to Wilhelm Röntgen, the unassuming genius who peeled back our skin and let science look beneath. All without ever asking for a single dime in return. He didn't want fortune or fame. He just wanted to see the truth, even when it was hidden in the dark. Charles Albert Galbart, the lawyer who tried to sue war out of existence. Diplomat, lawyer, peacemaker, and the kind of man who probably read legal texts for fun and dreamed in paragraphs. He was one of those well-meaning overachievers who didn't just believe in world peace. He tried to legislate it into being. And in 1902, the Nobel Committee handed him a Peace Prize for it. Likely because he was one of the few people on Earth who thought parliaments could solve international conflict with polite debate and arbitration treaties. Born on May 21, 1843 in Tramelan in the Jura region of Switzerland, Galbart had idealism in his blood. His father was a Protestant pastor and the family ethos was built around education, diplomacy, and a sturdy sense of duty. He studied in Barisel, Heidelberg, Bern, and even over in Paris, devouring law and political philosophy with the enthusiasm of a future bureaucrat on a mission. He eventually earned a doctorate in law and became a practicing attorney. But unlike most lawyers who are content to fight over contracts and property lines, Galbart had loftier goals. By the 1870s, he was actively involved in Swiss politics, representing the canton of Bern in the Grand Council and later in the National Council. He was a firm believer in liberal democracy, public education, and international cooperation. He was also fluent in multiple languages. A walking UN delegate before the UN was even a sketch on a napkin. Galbart wasn't a man of fiery speeches or dramatic gestures. He was a patient negotiator, planner, a man who could spend 3 hours rewriting a paragraph in a treaty until it was just ambiguous enough for everyone to agree to it. He rose to prominence through his work on public education reform and his reputation as a pragmatic, intelligent moderate. But his real passion, peace. In 1892, Galbart joined the Interparliamentary Union, the same organization co-founded by fellow peace laureate Frederick Pacy. The IPU was a revolutionary idea at the time, a voluntary gathering of legislators from different countries meeting to discuss peaceful conflict resolution. Galbart saw this as the future of diplomacy. Not kings and emperors yelling at each other over borders, but parliaments working it out over coffee and clauses. He rose through the ranks of the IPU quickly, eventually becoming its Secretary General. Under his leadership, the organization expanded significantly. He worked tirelessly to build bridges between parliaments across Europe and beyond, promoting arbitration treaties, arms reduction, and the peaceful settlement of disputes. Think of him as the world's most polite international lobbyist. He also served as director of the International Peace Bureau in Bonn, one of the earliest organized bodies dedicated entirely to preventing war. The Bureau coordinated peace movements, organized conferences, and distributed leaflets in an era when information still traveled slower than cavalry. Gobert was in the thick of it, writing letters, negotiating resolutions, and generally trying to inject a bit of rationality into the boiling cauldron of pre-World War I Europe. In 1902, the Nobel Peace Prize was awarded jointly to Gobert and A.I. Dukeman, another Swiss peace advocate and co-director of the Peace Bureau. Together they represented the growing belief that peace wasn't just a dream. It could be institutionalized, proceduralized, and dare we say bureaucratized. After Dukeman's death in 1906, Gobert took full leadership of the Peace Bureau, further entrenching his role as one of Europe's foremost peace administrators. He attended countless conferences, convened representatives from dozens of countries, and tirelessly promoted the idea of international arbitration long before it became fashionable. He wasn't flashy. He wasn't revolutionary. He was methodical. But make no mistake, he believed in peace the way some men believe in gravity. To go back, war was not just a tragedy. It was a failure of imagination and negotiation. He once said that peace was not merely the absence of war but the presence of justice. And he spent his life trying to make that vision real through legislative channels and collaborative diplomacy. On March 16, 1914, while attending a peace conference in Bern, Charles Alberta Gobert collapsed and died of a stroke. Just months later, Europe would plunge into World War I. It was a devastating irony. Gulbat had devoted his life to preventing such a catastrophe, and the very framework he helped build would struggle to survive the avalanche of nationalism and violence that followed. And yet, his work laid the foundation for future peace efforts. The League of Nations, the United Nations, and countless treaties and protocols that trace their roots to the institutions he nurtured. He believed law could tame chaos. He may not have lived to see it succeed, but he left behind a blueprint. Elie Duhamel, the quiet Swiss storm who filed for peace instead of war. Writer, educator, polyglot, bureaucrat, and a man who believed world peace could be achieved with patience, paperwork, and persistence. If Charles Alba Gobert was the legislative engine behind Switzerland's peace movement, Dukeman was the relentless rhythm, the steady heartbeat in the background, organizing, coordinating, and refusing to stop even when no one seemed to be listening. Born on February 19, 1833 in Geneva, Switzerland, Dukeman entered a world already riddled with rising industrial tensions, post-revolutionary ideologies, and the kind of fragile peace that held more by exhaustion than agreement. Geneva, perched comfortably in its seat of Swiss neutrality, would shape his worldview. He was educated at the Académie de Genève, where he quickly distinguished himself as a thinker with both idealistic vision and razor-sharp intellect. Dukeman spoke multiple languages fluently: French, German, Italian, English, and possibly a few more if the peace conferences demanded it. His multilingualism wasn't just academic flair. It was strategic. He believed diplomacy began with comprehension, and understanding another language meant understanding another worldview. He wasn't just fluent. He was attuned. He began his professional life as a journalist writing for progressive publications that promoted Republican ideals, social reform, and pacifism. His articles often dealt with the moral implications of war, the philosophical underpinnings of nonviolence, and the role of civil society in shaping international behavior. If Gobert was the diplomat working the corridors of power, Dukeman was the philosopher quietly loading up his intellectual artillery. He later turned to teaching and translation, holding positions as a tutor and eventually becoming a translator and editor for various Swiss organizations. From 1869 to 1891, he worked as Secretary General for the Jura-Simplon Railway Company, a significant logistical and infrastructural position. It might seem like a career tangent, but this role was where Ducommun refined his ability to manage sprawling operations, coordinate across jurisdictions, and deal with the mechanical and human parts of a complex system. These skills would later prove indispensable. In 1867, inspired by mounting political unrest and the rise of militarism across Europe, Ducommun founded the Ligue Internationale de la Liberté, International League for Peace and Freedom. This was not your typical drawing room debating society. It attracted philosophers like Victor Hugo and social theorists like John Stuart Mill. Ducommun aimed to create a permanent international platform for those who believed in diplomacy over violence. The League promoted universal disarmament, compulsory arbitration, and the creation of an international tribunal. Though the League eventually waned in influence, it laid the groundwork for what would come next. In 1891, when the International Peace Bureau IPB was founded in Bern, the first international non-governmental organization devoted entirely to peace, Ducommun was appointed Secretary General. Though the position was honorary, he essentially built the organization from the ground up. Working often alone or with minimal staff, Ducommun handled virtually every aspect of the Bureau's activities. He edited the Bureau's journal, organized international peace congresses, drafted model arbitration treaties, and corresponded with hundreds of activists, politicians, and academics across the globe. His desk was a global hub of correspondence, and he treated every letter, whether from a prime minister or a village priest, with equal care. He was methodical and stoic, but not without fire. Ducommun could be deeply impassioned in his writing, and his speeches, though rarely delivered in bombastic style, carried an emotional clarity that struck listeners. He believed that peace required structure, not just sentiment. He envisioned a world governed by international law, where nations would submit their disputes to neutral bodies rather than battlefield judgment. His work caught the attention of Alfred Nobel, who admired those attempting to prevent war through organized reason mechanisms. When the Nobel Peace Prize was established, Ducommun was an obvious choice. In 1902, he was awarded the prize jointly with Charles Albert. Nobel's committee noted not just his commitment to peace but his relentless energy in creating a functional, lasting institution for diplomacy. Unlike many laureates who used the prize to step away from the fray, Ducommun stayed into his 70s. He worked 10-hour days, kept up correspondence with activists around the world, and even managed to expand the Bureau's influence across continents. He was particularly interested in drawing in peace movements from Latin America and Asia, arguing that the peace movement had to be truly international if it hoped to endure. He wasn't universally loved. Some dismissed him as an idealist and others criticized him for being too focused on bureaucracy and not enough on mass mobilization. But Ducommun believed the world needed administrators as much as orators. Someone had to keep the ink flowing and the files in order while others gave the speeches. On December 7, 1906, after decades of service, a Ducker passed away in Bern just a few weeks later. Goat would follow. Their deaths marked the end of the first era of organized pacifism, a movement rooted in letters, resolutions, and face-to-face negotiations. Within 8 years, the world would descend into World War I, and much of their work would seem futile to a war-hungry generation. And yet, their legacy lived on. The IPB survived, and many of its documents, proposals, and institutional frameworks were absorbed by the League of Nations and later the United Nations. The very concept of international law of arbitration over aggression owes much to the tireless work of Ducommun and his paper Thin Army of Pacifists. He wasn't a general. He didn't lead marches. He didn't win political office. But he fought every day for a world that would rather write than shoot. And that perhaps is the quietest kind of revolution. So here's to Elie Ducombe, the quiet Swiss storm, the Clark of global conscience, and proof that you don't have to shout to make history. Theodore's son, the historian who turned ancient Rome into a bestseller. Theodore's son. If you've ever tried to Google something about Julius Caesar and ended up face-deep in Latin legal codes and footnotes the size of small novels, you probably have him to thank. A historian, jurist, politician, and professional overachiever. Mum's son was the sort of scholar who made everyone else in the library feel lazy. In 1902, he won the Nobel Prize in Literature. That's right. Not for poetry, not for fiction, but for writing about Roman law. And somehow it worked. Born on November 30th, 1817 in Garding in what was then the Danish Duchy of Schleswig. Theodore Mommsen was the son of a Lutheran minister. From an early age, it was clear this kid wasn't destined for a quiet life. He consumed classical texts the way others devoured candy. And by his teens, he was reportedly correcting his teachers on Cicero. He studied law at the University of Kiel and quickly established himself as a polymath. But unlike many scholars of the 19th century who confined themselves to cloistered studies, Mommsen was intellectually omnivorous and had zero interest in staying quiet. He wrote articles, argued with editors, and frequently launched into debates with colleagues that left entire faculties trembling. After a brief stint as a school teacher and then as a war correspondent covering revolutionary movements in Italy, because of course he did, he returned to academia and received his doctorate in Roman law. From there, he joined the Prussian Academy of Sciences and began working on what would become the defining obsession of his life: the corpus of Roman inscriptions known as the Corpus Inscription Latinarum. It might sound like a sleep aid, but this was monumental work. Mommsen traveled all over Europe cataloging every scrap of Latin stone carving he could find. His notes were exhaustive, his categories detailed, his enthusiasm maniacal. He treated every chipped tombstone and defaced milestone like it was the Rosetta Stone. And yes, he published like a man on fire. By the time he was in his 50s, Mommsen had become a household name in scholarly circles, a man both revered and feared for the scale of his intellect. But it was his magnum opus, A History of Rome, that catapulted him from historian to literary laureate. First published in the 1850s, the multi-volume series brought ancient Rome to life with the drama and energy of a political thriller. His portrayal of Julius Caesar was so vivid, so impassioned that readers swore they could hear the Senate echoing in the background. Mommsen didn't just analyze history, he dramatized it. He presented Rome not as a relic but as a mirror for modern Europe. Its ambitions, its corruption, its seismic shifts. He wrote about class struggles, populism, bureaucracy, and political decay with such intensity that his work resonated with politicians as much as classicists. He was as comfortable quoting Cicero as he was warning about the dangers of authoritarianism in contemporary governments. That's right. Mommsen wasn't just a historian. He was a public intellectual, a member of the Prussian House of Representatives, and a fierce liberal. He opposed anti-Semitism, fought for constitutional governance, and once publicly denounced Otto von Bismarck in a parliamentary speech that made headlines. He wrote countless articles on civil rights, the role of the state and the dangers of populist strongmen. His words written in the syntax of Cicero, but fueled by the outrage of Voltaire, earned him enemies as well as admirers. He was asked more than once to tone it down. He never did. By 1902, when the Swedish Academy was reviewing nominees for the Nobel Prize in Literature, they were facing the usual suspects. Novelists, poets, and dramatists saw something else. A writer whose work didn't just describe the world. but dissected its bones and sinus. His History of Rome was, in their words, the greatest work written in the field of historical writing. So they gave it to him. At age 84, Theodore's son became the first and so far only historian to win the Nobel Prize in Literature. He didn't write a grand acceptance speech. He didn't bask in the limelight. He simply returned to his desk, opened another volume of Latin inscriptions, and kept working. He died the following year in 1903 with his desk still cluttered with drafts. He left behind an intellectual empire, over 1,500 published works, including 5 volumes of Roman constitutional law, and dozens of articles that still haunt the footnotes of modern classics. His son turned the dusty marble of antiquity into something thrilling, urgent, and alive. He showed the world that history could be literature, that truth could be dramatic, and that even emperors looked less grand when viewed through the lens of hard-earned evidence. So, here's to Theodore's son, the man who gave Rome its modern voice, armed with nothing but a fountain pen, a mountain of parchment, and a thunderous command of the past. Ronald Ross, the mosquito hunter who outsmarted malaria. It's time we talk about bugs. More specifically, the buzzing, blood-sucking menace that is the mosquito and the man who cracked its deadly secret. Sir Ronald Ross, a British physician, poet, mathematician, and occasional sufferer of institutional rage. Ross didn't just contribute to medicine. He rewrote our entire understanding of infectious disease. In 1902, he won the Nobel Prize in Physiology or Medicine for his work on malaria. And you better believe he earned every ounce of that awkwardly named honor. Born on May 13, 1857 in Almora in the foothills of the Himalayas, Ross was raised in the swirling colonial machinery of British India. His father was a general in the British Army, and young Ronald was carted around from cantonment to cantonment, learning discipline, resilience, and a quiet contempt for tropical illnesses. He was sent to England for schooling and eventually studied medicine at St. Bartholomew's Hospital in London. He didn't exactly dazzle his professors, but he squeaked through. After graduating, Ross joined the Indian Medical Service, which basically meant the British Empire paid him to work in underfunded hospitals in mosquito-infested outposts. He served in Madras, Bangalore, and various backwater stations treating cholera, dysentery, and other colonial plagues. But malaria, that insidious fevered phantom, was the one that gnawed his brain. In Ross' day, malaria killed hundreds of thousands every year and made tropical colonies almost ungovernable in hot seasons. Scientists had figured out that it had something to do with blood, but not the how, the who, or the biting agent. Enter Ross, part doctor, part detective, inspired by the work of French physician Charles-Louis Alphonse Lavar, who had discovered the malaria parasite in blood samples. Ross became obsessed with tracing the full life cycle of the parasite. He was convinced it involved mosquitoes, and in the late 1890s, he began to hunt the insect like a man possessed, working in primitive labs with a microscope that should have been in a museum. Ross dissected mosquitoes day and night. He starved them, fed them infected blood, then dissected them to see what horrors might be multiplying in their tiny bodies. It wasn't glamorous. It wasn't even particularly hygienic. But it was relentless. On August 20th, 1897, in Secundra about India, Ross finally saw what he'd been chasing: malarial parasites developing in the stomach of an Anopheles mosquito. He had proof. Mosquitoes weren't just annoying. They were flying syringes of death. He later wrote in his notebook, "This day will be commemorated as a red-letter day in the history of medical science." He wasn't wrong. Ross continued his research in Sierra Leone, where he confirmed the transmission cycle in humans and laid the foundation for modern mosquito control. He mapped the connection between environment, breeding grounds, and disease transmission, turning medicine into environmental strategy. It was the birth of preventive medicine. In 1902, the Nobel Committee awarded Ross the prize for his work on malaria, by which he has shown how it enters the organism and thereby has laid the foundation for successful research on this disease and methods of combating it. It was a historic recognition not just of discovery but of a whole new way to understand epidemiology. Of course, Ross wasn't exactly a saint. He was notoriously combative. He feuded for decades with Italian scientists who were also studying malaria, most notably Giovanni Battista Grassi. Ross claimed he had been robbed of credit. Grassi claimed Ross was arrogant and territorial. The truth: they were both brilliant and probably both insufferable. Ross also dabbled in poetry and mathematics. His poems ranged from the noble to the unintentionally hilarious. He spent the rest of his career promoting public health, researching tropical medicine, and running the Liverpool School of Tropical Medicine. He also advised governments during wartime about disease prevention and sanitation. But he always carried the badge of his malaria work as his greatest achievement. Sir Ronald Ross died in 1932 in London. He was buried at Putney Vale Cemetery. Thanks to Ross, the fight against malaria had a path forward. Thanks to his microscope, the invisible enemy became visible. And thanks to his sheer stubbornness, medical history took a sharp turn toward modernity. So, here's to Ronald Ross, the mosquito hunter, the parasite prophet, the man who turned one mosquito bite into a Nobel-worthy revelation. Emil Fischer, the sugar chemist who made science stick. Let's pivot from mosquitoes to molecules. Darling, now we toast Emil Fischer, the German chemist who didn't just play with sugars and proteins. He mapped them with the elegance of a crafter and the persistence of a perfectionist. In 1902, he became the second recipient of the Nobel Prize in Chemistry for his pioneering work on the structure of carbohydrates and purines. His legacy: the biochemical world owes him basically everything short of caffeine-induced panic. Born on October 9, 1852 in Jusken near Cologne, Germany, Hellmann Emil Fischer entered the world during a period of rapid industrial and scientific change. His father, Loren Fischer, was a successful lumber merchant and a practical, non-nonsense businessman who hoped his son would one day take over the family trade. But young Emil showed early signs of being more interested in puzzles than planks. First, Fischer tried to meet his father's expectations, dabbling in business and studying at the University of Bonn. But he soon discovered chemistry, and that was the end of any dreams of lumber dynasties. Transferring to the University of Strasbourg and later earning his doctorate at the University of Würzburg under the legendary Adolf von Bay, Fischer found his calling in organic chemistry. He had a natural talent for synthesis, the laboratory equivalent of magic tricks with atoms, and an almost supernatural patience for repetitive complex analysis. In the 1880s, Fischer began his groundbreaking work on purines, a group of compounds that would later become central to our understanding of genetics, energy transfer, and even pharmaceuticals. He was the first to synthesize purine itself as well as numerous derivatives including caffeine, theobromine from chocolate, and uric acid. Imagine mapping a jungle of molecular structures with nothing but a crude lab setup and sheer brilliance. That's what Fischer was doing, one reaction at a time. But his real claim to fame came with his systematic investigation into carbohydrates, at a time when sugars were chemically understood about as well as astrology. Pfizer painstakingly identified, cataloged, and synthesized dozens of simple sugars, monosaccharides, and their combinations, dischlorite, using chemical reactions. He deduced the exact spatial configuration of glucose, fructose, mannose, galactose, and more. This wasn't just academic trivia. Fisher was solving one of the biggest biochemical mysteries of the day: how the arrangement of atoms affected a molecule's behavior in the body. If two sugars had the same formula but different structures, they could behave completely differently. This led to his formulation of stereochemistry models for sugars, which later fed directly into the field of structural biology and our understanding of enzymes and DNA. And speaking of enzymes, Fisher's famous lock and key hypothesis proposed in the 1890s revolutionized how scientists understood biological catalysts. He suggested that an enzyme and its substrate fit together with precise specificity like a key in a lock. It was a beautifully simple model for an impossibly complex biological phenomenon, and it paved the way for modern enzymology, pharmaceuticals, and medical diagnostics. Fisher didn't just unlock molecules. He built empires of knowledge. He trained an entire generation of chemists, establishing chemical research institutions at Erlangen, Würzburg, and finally the University of Berlin, where he served as director of the chemistry department. Under his leadership, Berlin became one of the most prestigious chemistry hubs in Europe. In 1902, the Nobel Committee awarded him the prize for his work on sugar and purine synthesis. There was no controversy, no debate, just awe. He had done what most chemists only dreamed of. He turned the chaos of nature into a reproducible, logical structure. He made chemistry a language anyone could learn, provided they had the patience to memorize hundreds of reaction pathways and the resilience to work through endless recrystallizations. But Fisher's brilliance came at a cost. He was a perfectionist to the point of obsession. His lab notebooks were works of art. His experiments repeated until no error could survive. Colleagues admired him. Students feared him. And over time, the pressure took its toll. Tragedy struck during World War I. Fisher, a lifelong pacifist, was devastated by the war and even more so by its personal consequences. 2 of his sons died in the fighting. Another returned home wounded. The losses broke something in him. He continued working, but his once tireless energy began to ebb. He suffered from stomach cancer and his mental health deteriorated. In 1919, overwhelmed by grief and illness, Fisher took his own life at the age of 66. His death shocked the scientific community, but it also galvanized their appreciation for his legacy. Today, Fisher is remembered not only for what he discovered, but for how he changed the practice of chemistry. His name is etched into scientific terminology. The Fisher projection is still used to represent three-dimensional molecular structures on two-dimensional paper. His theories form the bedrock of modern biochemistry, and his approach, precise, patient, unrelentingly thorough, remains the gold standard for chemical research. So here's to Emil Fisher, the man who decoded the language of life's building blocks. One carbon atom at a time. He found logic in chaos, harmony, and complexity, and he showed the world that science, like art, is often built on obsession. Peter Zehn, the physicist who split light and shattered assumptions. Grab your goggles and prepare for photons, darling, because now we're diving into the curious brilliance of Peter Zehn, a Dutch physicist who didn't just observe the universe. He bent its light through a magnetic lens and made the quantum world flicker into view. In 1902, he shared the Nobel Prize in Physics with his mentor Rick Lawrence for their discovery and explanation of what became known as the Zehn effect. Sound obscure. Not once you realize it cracked open the door to quantum mechanics and gave scientists a way to watch electrons squirm under pressure. Born on May 25, 1865 in the sleepy fishing village of Zonair in the Netherlands, Peter Zeeman grew up in a place where not much happened quickly. The stars were bright, the nights were long, and the waves probably offered more drama than his school books. But young Peter had a mind for precision. As a teenager, He observed the aurora borealis in 1883 and sent a detailed report to a leading Dutch journal. It was published. The kid was still in high school. He went on to study physics at the University of Leiden, where he came under the wing of Rik Lorentz, a future Nobel laureate and one of the great theoretical physicists of the age. Lorentz was the man of equations. Zine, the man of experiments. Together, they would form one of science's great double X. By the mid-1890s, Zine was knee-deep in the study of optics, the behavior of light, that slippery, dazzling mystery that every physicist in Europe was trying to explain. It was a golden age for electromagnetic theory. Maxwell had laid the foundation. Hers had shown that waves could fly through the air. And Zine was about to poke a new hole in the known world. In 1896, while working on his doctoral research, Zine decided to investigate how spectral lines, those narrow bands of color that appear when light is passed through a prism, behaved in a magnetic field. These spectral lines were thought to be stable, immutable signatures of elements. But Zine, meticulous as ever, observed something strange. The lines split when exposed to a magnetic field. It wasn't much at first. A faint broadening. Then, under stronger fields, a definite split. This was the first experimental observation of what would be called the Zine effect. The splitting of a spectral line into multiple components when the source is in a magnetic field. It might sound niche, but it was seismic. It confirmed Lorentz's theory of electromagnetic radiation, and it offered direct observable proof that electrons, still not fully understood at the time, were influenced by magnetic forces. Zine published his results in 1897. The scientific community went into a frenzy. Here was hard data on the inner behavior of atoms. The Zine effect wasn't just a laboratory curiosity. It became a critical tool in astrophysics and quantum mechanics. By analyzing how spectral lines split in magnetic fields, scientists could now study the properties of atoms, stars, and even galaxies. In 1902, Zine and Lorentz were jointly awarded the Nobel Prize in Physics. Zine, just 37 years old, was one of the youngest recipients to date. The Nobel Committee praised his precision, his persistence, and his ability to find the extraordinary in the apparently mundane. But Zine wasn't done. He continued to work in optics and electromagnetism, eventually becoming a professor at the University of Amsterdam and the director of the university's physics laboratory. He also mentored generations of Dutch physicists, quietly building a legacy that would ripple through the 20th century. Despite his fame, Zine remained modest. He was more interested in apparatus than applause. He preferred quiet precision to flamboyant theory. His lab was his cathedral, his spectroscopes, sacred tools. He didn't theorize wildly. He observed relentlessly. He found patterns in vibrations and meaning in minuscule changes. Zine's work laid the groundwork for the quantum revolution. When Niels Bohr, Vera Heisenberg, and the rest of the quantum crowd came blazing onto the scene in the 1920s, they built on foundations that Zine helped cement. Without his experimental confirmation of electron behavior, much of modern physics would still be theoretical poetry. He passed away on October 9, 1943 during World War II. His death was quiet, but his influence was not. The Zeeman effect is still used in laboratories and observatories today. It helps analyze sunspots, magnetic fields in distant galaxies, and the properties of new materials. It's one of those discoveries that just keeps giving. So here's to Peter Zine, the man who looked at light and saw it stutter, split, and reveal the secrets it had been hiding since the beginning of time. A master of observation, a disciple of detail, and the quiet physicist who caught electrons in the act. Rik Lorentz, the equation whisperer who tamed light and time. Take a breath. My brilliant night owls. Because we're about to enter the brainy end of physics. Rik Anton Lorentz, Dutch theoretical physicist, Nobel Prize co-winner with Peter Zien in 1902, and one of the few humans whose math helped Albert Einstein look smart. If Zien gave us experimental proof, Lorentz gave us the equations to understand it. Together, they were the Lennon and McCartney of early 20th century physics, only with less hair and more vectors. Born on July 18, 1853 in Arnhem in the eastern Netherlands, Rik was the son of Gerrit Frederick Lorentz, a well-educated and practical man who managed a nursery. Young Hendrik grew up in a stable, intellectually encouraging environment where he was more likely to be found scribbling numbers than chasing sheep. He was bookish, shy, and mathematically precocious, a walking equation. Even as a child, he attended the University of Leiden, the oldest university in the Netherlands, where he initially pursued mathematics and physics. By the age of 23, he had earned his PhD with a dissertation on the reflection and refraction of light. It was meticulous work, dense and rigorous, but even then you could sense his future legacy, combining theoretical depth with physical relevance. He had the elegance of a mathematician and the curiosity of a natural philosopher. In 1878, at just 24, he was appointed professor of theoretical physics at Leiden. This was not a small deal. The position had been specially created for him, the first of its kind in the Netherlands, marking Lorentz as a rising star. Over the next 4 decades, he transformed Leiden into a world-renowned hub of physics, drawing in some of the brightest minds of the era. What did he do there? Only reshape the way we understand electromagnetism and matter. In the 1890s, he developed what became known as the Lorentz force law, the foundational equation describing how electrically charged particles behave when they move through electric and magnetic fields. It was a profound step forward, unifying electromagnetism and mechanics. Later, it became indispensable for technologies ranging from electric motors to particle accelerators. But the true magic was in what he did next. The Lorentz transformations. Let's rewind to the biggest problem in late 19th century physics: the behavior of light. Classical mechanics said that velocities should add up. So if you were moving toward a beam of light, you should observe it as traveling faster. But you don't. The speed of light appears to be constant no matter how fast you're moving. It broke every rule. Enter Lorentz. He proposed that time and space must contract and dilate depending on motion. In 1895, he published the mathematical formulas now known as the Lorentz transformations, which describe how measurements of space and time change for observers in relative motion. These transformations explained why light speed never budged because time and space themselves were elastic. It was radical. It was brilliant. And it set the table for Albert Einstein's theory of special relativity in 1905. Einstein himself said he stood on Lorentz's shoulders. Without Lorentz, there might be no E equals mc squared, no general relativity, no GPS satellites. Meanwhile, in the lab, Peter Zien had been experimenting with how spectral lines behave in magnetic fields. When he observed that they split into components, a phenomenon now called the Zien effect, he turned to Lorentz for an explanation. Lorentz did not disappoint. He used his electromagnetic theory to explain how magnetic fields alter the motion of electrons within atoms, causing the observed spectral changes. It was one of the first times theory and experiment had come together so perfectly in physics. For this, the two shared the 1902 Nobel Prize in Physics. The citation read, "In recognition of the extraordinary service they rendered by their researchers into the influence of magnetism upon radiation phenomena." It was a joint win, but both men brought distinct genius to the table. Zien, the meticulous experimentalist; Lorentz, the quiet wizard of the blackboard. But Lawrence was far more than a physicist's physicist. He was a philosopher of science, deeply engaged with the conceptual foundations of nature. He explored the ether theory, the prevailing idea that space was filled with the mysterious substance through which light waves traveled. Although Einstein would later dispense with the ether altogether, Lawrence's efforts to understand it helped clarify the need for a new conceptual framework. In addition to his theoretical work, Lawrence was an extraordinary mentor. He taught and inspired a generation of physicists, including Paul Ehrenfest, who succeeded him at Leiden, and many others who would become central figures in 20th century physics. He chaired the famous SV conferences where Einstein and Bohr debated quantum mechanics, and his opinion was considered gospel among physicists. During World War I, Lawrence served as a scientific statesman working to preserve international collaboration in science even as nations tore each other apart. He was widely admired for his grace, clarity, and moral compass. In 1923, he was appointed director of the Taylor's Museum in Haarlem, a position that allowed him to continue his research while also promoting science to the public. He never stopped working. Even in his 70s, he was producing insightful papers, giving lectures, and chairing scientific committees. He died on February 4, 1928, at the age of 74. The Netherlands gave him a national funeral. Schools paused. Trains stopped. Telegraph offices fell silent for 1 full minute. The country stood still for a man who had measured motion with unprecedented precision. His legacy lives in the physics of light, matter, space, and time. His equations are etched into every textbook. The Lorentz force, Lorentz transformations, Lorentz factor. He's practically a co-author of the universe. So, here's to Hendrik Lorentz, the master of transformations, the mathematician of motion, the mind behind relativity before relativity had a name. William Randall Kmür, the mustachioed crusader who talked peace into Parliament. Oh darling, if ever there was a gentleman who looked like he'd walked straight out of a Victorian political cartoon, holding a peace treaty in one hand and a sharp-witted insult in the other, it was William Randall Kmür. Think booming speeches, bristling mustaches, and stubbornly idealistic pacifism delivered with a heavy East London accent. In 1903, he became the sole recipient of the Nobel Peace Prize. And while some laureates built peace with treaties or bullets, Kramer did it with petitions, speeches, and a soul forged in the fire of working-class Britain. Born on March 18, 1828 in Farm, Hampshire, Kmür didn't exactly emerge into a world of privilege and powdered wigs. His father abandoned the family when he was a child, and his mother, a deeply religious, fiercely determined woman, raised him alone. Money was tight, but values were rich. Hard work, honesty, and justice. She was a Methodist who taught him that peace was a moral imperative, not just a diplomatic preference. Kramer became a carpenter, a trade that gave him both literal and metaphorical tools. He joined the labor movement early and eventually made his way into trade union organizing, rubbing shoulders with radicals, social reformers, and the kind of orators who could talk a picket line into Parliament. By the 1860s, Kmür had joined the newly forming peace societies across Britain and Europe. Unlike the posh pacifists who saw war as a vulgarity best solved over port and poetry, Kramer was all grit and grind. He wasn't afraid to shout in the House of Commons or wave anti-war leaflets at prime ministers. He believed peace had to be popular, led by working people, and protected by international law. In 1885, he was elected to the House of Commons as a Liberal Member of Parliament for Haggerston, a working-class district of East London. He didn't try to climb the ladder to cabinet positions. He wasn't interested in power for its own sake. He had a mission to make international arbitration a standard part of diplomacy. Why settle disputes with gunfire? He argued, when you could settle them with discussion. Khmer was a central figure in the formation of the Interparliamentary Union IPU in 1889 alongside his French counterpart Frédéric Pécy. The IPU brought together lawmakers from across Europe who believed that talking was better than shelling. Khmer's East End growl echoed in the halls of many peace conferences. He organized. He rallied. He translated the abstract hopes of pacifism into the legislative language of arbitration agreements and neutral courts. And he was effective. He was instrumental in the passage of an Anglo-American arbitration treaty in 1897. Though heartbreakingly, it was never ratified by the U.S. Senate. Still, he kept at it, building transatlantic peace networks, writing to American presidents, hobnobbing with senators, and reminding anyone who would listen that peace was not just idealistic. It was economical, rational, and morally necessary. He corresponded with presidents from Grover Cleveland to Theodore Roosevelt. He convinced Andrew Carnegie to fund peace organizations and helped lay the intellectual groundwork for what would become the Hague's Permanent Court of Arbitration. His advocacy brought the language of pacifism into mainstream politics, one amendment and backroom negotiation at a time. When the Nobel Committee awarded him the Peace Prize in 1903, it was both a recognition and a slight surprise. Kramer wasn't royalty. He wasn't a diplomat. He was a carpenter turned MP with a love of peace and a loathing of pomp. But he had done what so few could, made peace practical. He even used his Nobel Prize money to further the work of the IPU and fund peace literature. He didn't believe in titles or privileges. When Edward Iaith offered a knighthood, Khmer eventually accepted begrudgingly because he believed it might give more weight to the causes he championed. And so, in 1907, Sir Randall Khmer walked through Parliament, knighthood or not, still carrying the same message. Peace is not passive. It is work. He died on July 22, 1908 at the age of 80. His legacy etched into the quiet treaties and arbitration mechanisms that grew in his wake. The IPU continued to thrive, and many of its ideas would eventually find a home in the League of Nations and later the United Nations. He proved that a trade unionist with callous hands and a clear conscience could change the world. So here's to William Randall Khmer, the carpenter who outer-argued generals, the parliamentarian who made pacifism practical, and the man who proved you don't need a sword to fight for peace. Jernab Jernin, the Viking of verse who fought with a pen. Gather around my literary romantics, because now we trek through fjords and flourish into verse with the grand old lion of Norwegian letters. Bernstein Bernan Nobel laureate in literature 1903 novelist, playwright, poet, orator, rebel, romantic and occasional national lightning rod. If Henrik Ibsen was the brooding brain of 19th-century Norway, Bernstein was the booming voice, a theatrical thunderous force who could rally crowds, write ballads, and almost certainly outtalk anyone in Europe. Born on December 8, 1832 in Kirken, Norway, Bernstein came into the world in a modest parsonage surrounded by mountains and myth. His father, a Lutheran minister, moved the family to the rural parish of Nesset in the Romal Valley when Bernstein was a child. There, amidst dramatic landscapes and peasant traditions, he absorbed the rugged spirit of Norwegian life. It wasn't long before he discovered his love for storytelling. He was the kind of kid who'd recite sagas by the fireplace and dramatize dinner conversations like it was a Shakespearean rehearsal. He attended the Helpberg Latin School in Christiania, modern-day Oslo, where he studied alongside future literary giants like Henrik Ibsen, Jonas Lie, and Alexander Kielland. This scrappy little school was a crucible for talent and rebellion. Bernan, tall, boisterous, with a voice like a church bell, stood out even then. He devoured history, myth, and drama. His earliest ambitions were theatrical. Literature wasn't a job for him. It was destiny. He began his career as a journalist and critic, quickly gaining notoriety for his firebrand prose and no-holds-barred commentary. In 1857, he exploded onto the literary scene with his debut novel, Synnöve Speken, a sentimental yet stirring tale of peasant life that was practically soaked in nationalism. The book was a hit for Norway, a country still yoked to Sweden in a tense union. The novel felt like a declaration of cultural independence. His early works, known as his peasant tales, were more than pastoral nostalgia. They were political. They offered dignity to the rural poor, celebrated Norwegian traditions, and rejected the imported snobbery of Danish and Swedish influence. He followed Synnöve Speken with Anna 1858, A Happy Boy 1860, and The Fisher Maiden 1868, solidifying his role as the literary voice of Norwegian selfhood. But Bernson was never one to stick to a single genre. He launched into playwriting with an enthusiasm that bordered on mania. His dramas ranged from historical epics like Sigismund 1862 to contemporary social commentaries like The Editor 1875 and Beyond Human Power 1895. His characters were larger than life. Kings, rebels, priests, lovers, and truth-tellers, always grappling with moral dilemmas and national identity. Beneath the bombast, though, was a craftsman. Bernson understood narrative tension, pacing, and theatricality. He knew how to ignite a scene with dialogue and infuse a soliloquy with political fire. His plays were performed across Scandinavia, and his fame grew beyond the fjords. Parallel to his literary pursuits, Bernson threw himself into political life. He was a passionate advocate for Norwegian independence and was closely associated with the Liberal Party. He gave fiery speeches on parliamentary reform, civil liberties, and the rights of minority groups. He was a relentless voice for women's education and suffrage years before it became a fashionable cause. He denounced militarism, authoritarianism, and clericalism. If there was a moral battle to be fought, Bernson strapped on a rhetorical sword and charged. His activism reached beyond Norway. He was one of the first major European intellectuals to stand publicly against anti-Semitism, lending his voice to the defense of Alfred Dreyfus during the infamous Dreyfus Affair in France. At a time when many of his contemporaries stayed safely silent, Bernson wrote blistering essays and traveled across Europe denouncing injustice. Let's not forget the anthem. Oh yes, Javi Elskadetta landed. Yes. We love this country, which he wrote in the 1860s, became the heartbeat of Norway's national awakening. Set to music by his cousin Rikard Nordre, it was embraced by revolutionaries and school children alike. Even today, Norwegians belt it out at national celebrations with the kind of emotional conviction usually reserved for funerals and football finals. In 1903, at the age of 70, Bernson was awarded the Nobel Prize in Literature. The Nobel Committee praised him for his noble, magnificent, and versatile poetry, which has always been distinguished by both the freshness of its inspiration and the rare purity of its spirit. It was recognition not just of literary skill, but of his role in shaping a nation. He spent his later years as a roving statesman of letters. He traveled extensively throughout Europe, writing, lecturing, and continuing to stir the pot. He befriended Alfred Nobel himself and was a strong early supporter of the Nobel Peace Prize, arguing that literature and diplomacy were twin forces in the moral evolution of society. Bernson died on April 26, 1910 in Paris, but Norway brought him home. His state funeral was a national event. Thousands attended. The entire country seemed to pause. His coffin was carried through the streets, draped in the flag of a country he helped to find. It was the kind of send-off usually reserved for monarchs or saints. Bernson was neither. He was louder. So here's to Johnson, the Viking of verse, the dramatist of democracy, the father of the anthem, and the man who showed that a well-aimed sentence can shake a nation. Niels Ryberg Finneson, the ray of light who battled disease from a sick bed. Now we step into the soft, glowing edge of medicine where science met sunlight and hope came in beams. Our subject, Niels Ryberg Finneson, the Icelandic-Danish physician who in 1903 became the first DNE to receive the Nobel Prize in Physiology or Medicine. His weapon, light. Not metaphorically, literally. A man whose body gradually failed him, but whose ideas illuminated a new frontier in medicine. Born on December 15, 1860 in Torchen, the small capital of the Faroe Islands, Finneson emerged into a world as wild and harsh as it was beautiful. His ancestry was a mix of Icelandic and Danish lineage. His father, Hannes Finneson, served as the governor of the Faroe Islands. His mother, Johanna Foreman, died when Niels was a child, leaving behind a deeply sensitive boy, already prone to introspection and illness. The physical ailments that dogged his life began early. He was small, pale, and frequently exhausted. Throughout adolescence, he suffered from fatigue, digestive issues, and joint pain. Later, he would be diagnosed with a progressive illness that most historians believe to have been Niemann-Pick disease or a related metabolic disorder. Whatever the specifics, it left him gradually more debilitated as the years passed. By his late 20s, he was partially paralyzed and eventually became confined to his home and later to his bed. But if his body slowed, his mind surged. Finneson moved to Copenhagen in his youth to attend school and later enrolled in the University of Copenhagen to study medicine. He was a diligent, thoughtful student, but what set him apart wasn't his clinical work. It was his insatiable curiosity about the body's relationship with its environment, especially light. He became fixated on the properties of natural light, ultraviolet rays, and the physiological changes they seem to produce in both plants and animals. He noticed that sun exposure seemed to help some conditions, particularly those involving the skin. He also noted that those deprived of light often developed poor health, especially in northern countries during dark winters. While the connection between sun and well-being might seem obvious now, at the time it was deeply uncharted territory. Phototherapy or light-based treatment was still thought of as superstition wrapped in science. Finneson wanted to make it empirical, testable, and clinical. By the 1890s, he had begun working on controlled experiments. His early subjects were himself and animals. He discovered that blue and violet light, the higher energy end of the visible spectrum, had a pronounced effect on living cells, particularly bacteria. He theorized that if ultraviolet light could kill microbes, then it might be harnessed to treat infections and skin diseases, especially those resistant to conventional treatments. In 1893, Finneson published a seminal paper outlining his theory that light could be used as a medical treatment, especially in cases of tuberculosis affecting the skin like lupus vulgaris. The reaction from the medical community was cautious, often skeptical, but he persisted. He designed special arc lamps with lenses and filters to focus specific wavelengths of light onto lesions and wounds. These devices were more than just gimmicks. They were early examples of targeted therapy. He began clinical trials and saw astonishing results. Patients with chronic lupus lesions, many considered untreatable at the time, began to heal. Red ulcerated skin smoothed and closed. Disfigurement softened. Quality of life returned. It was a breakthrough. By 1896, Finneson established the Finneson Medical Light Institute in Copenhagen, dedicated solely to the therapeutic use of light. It was a marvel, an institution where rays of the electromagnetic spectrum were harnessed and regulated like medicine. Word spread. Soon hospitals across Europe were requesting equipment, documentation, and training. Doctors in France, Germany, and even the United States began to replicate his results. Finson's reputation grew, though he never reveled in it. He remained reclusive, frequently in too much pain to stand or speak for long. He would direct teams from his bed using notes and short dictated messages. Yet, in his weakened state, he oversaw dozens of successful cases, maintained correspondence with the leading medical minds of the day, and continued to refine his techniques. In 1903, the Nobel Committee awarded him the Nobel Prize in Physiology or Medicine. The citation read, "In recognition of his contribution to the treatment of diseases, especially lupus vulgaris, with concentrated light radiation whereby he has opened a new avenue for medical science." It was more than a prize. It was validation of a new paradigm, light as medicine. But Finlayson would not live long to enjoy the legacy. His health continued to decline sharply after 1902. Even with devoted care from his wife, Ingeborg Ball-Lev, and a team of assistants, he became increasingly frail. He died on September 24, 1904 at just 43 years old. Yet what he left behind was staggering. The Finlayson Institute continued to operate for decades, and his work laid the groundwork for modern phototherapy, photodynamic therapy, and dermatological laser treatment. His research foreshadowed the way light and radiation would be used to treat everything from psoriasis to certain forms of cancer. Even in space medicine, where sunlight deprivation is a risk for astronauts, echoes of Finlayson's work remain. He was a man who understood darkness intimately, both in the physical sense and in the form of personal suffering. Yet, he chose to work with light, to measure it, harness it, and share its healing properties with the world. His scientific contributions were enormous, but his symbolic legacy is just as powerful. That limitation is not the enemy of discovery. Sometimes it's the beginning. So, here's to Niels Ryberg Finlayson, the light doctor, the still-bodied revolutionary, the man who turned sunlight into salvation from a bed he could barely leave. Svante Arrhenius, the reluctant revolutionary who measured the future. Gather your flasks and equations, darling, because now we salute the Swedish chemist who rattled the scientific world with ions, acids, and a startling theory about carbon dioxide that still echoes in climate debates today. Svante Arrhenius, recipient of the 1903 Nobel Prize in Chemistry, didn't just help create physical chemistry. He set the stage for how we understand everything from batteries to global warming. Born on February 19, 1859 in Vik near Oops, Sweden, Svante August Arrhenius was a child prodigy who could read by the age of 3 and perform complex arithmetic before he was out of short pants. He was a solitary boy, introverted and intense. His early life was full of math, science, and a kind of social awkwardness that would become his lifelong companion. He didn't win friends easily, but he was magnetically drawn to problems. He studied at UPS University and later moved to the Physical Institute of the Swedish Academy of Sciences in Stockholm. While his grades were unremarkable, his questions were revolutionary. In the 1880s, he developed a theory that dissolved salts split into charged particles, what we now call ions, even without electricity present. This was outrageous at the time. The idea that common table salt could fall apart into charged fragments in water sounded absurd to many chemists. He submitted his theory in a dissertation. The academic reviewers were underwhelmed. He received the lowest possible passing grade. That's right. The Nobel Prize winner barely passed his PhD. But Arrhenius was undeterred. He kept refining his ideas. Eventually, his work formed the basis of electrolytic dissociation theory. He argued that acids and bases were defined by the presence of ions, a framework still taught today. In effect, he helped invent modern acid-based chemistry. His theories were validated by growing experimental evidence, and he began to gain recognition outside Sweden. Still at home, he was often treated as a troublemaker, a bit too smart for his own good, despite his frosty relationship with the Swedish academic elite. Arrhenius became one of the founding figures of the new field of physical chemistry. His ion theory combined with thermodynamics and reaction rates helped turn chemistry from a dusty, smelly art into a precise science. He also did fundamental work on the rates of chemical reactions, creating equations that linked temperature and reaction speed, concepts that would later become essential in everything from industrial chemistry to pharmaceutical development. In 1903, he was awarded the Nobel Prize in Chemistry in recognition of the extraordinary services he has rendered to the advancement of chemistry by his electrolytic theory of dissociation. It was a somewhat ironic moment given that many of the men who voted for him had once considered him borderline delusional. But Arrhenius had earned his moment, and he knew it. He was the first Swede to win the chemistry prize, and he would use that leverage to become a major figure in Swedish science. He helped found the Nobel Institute for Physical Chemistry, served on the Nobel Committee, and used his influence to shape the early direction of the prizes. He was not shy about promoting scientists he admired or opposing those he didn't. Let's just say diplomacy was never his strong suit. But there was another side to Arrhenius, the visionary. In 1896, years before his Nobel win, he published a paper that would later prove far more important than even he realized. In it, he calculated how changes in the concentration of carbon dioxide in the Earth's atmosphere could affect global temperatures. He reasoned that a doubling of CO2 could result in a significant warming of the planet, what we now call the greenhouse effect. At the time, the idea was considered more curious than alarming. Arrhenius himself saw global warming as potentially beneficial, a way to stave off future ice ages. But his equations were sound. More than a century later, climate scientists would revisit his work and realize this man working with only a slide rule and a candle had predicted the core mechanism of anthropogenic climate change. He continued writing and researching for the rest of his life, publishing popular science books and essays. He had an uncanny ability to leap between disciplines: physics, astronomy, meteorology, and physiology. He even dabbled in theories about the origin of life, speculating that spores could travel through space, a theory now called panspermia. Not all of his ideas held up, but the sheer breadth of his curiosity was unmatched. He died in 1927 in Stockholm, having finally earned the respect and authority that had eluded him in his younger years. Today, his name lives on in the Arrhenius equation, in textbooks on acids and bases, and in the foundational models of climate science. So here's Svante Arrhenius, the awkward genius who saw the invisible, measured the immeasurable, and reminded us that even the quietest revolutions can shake the foundations of science. Marie Curie, the woman who glowed in the dark and never backed down. Take a deep breath. Dear dreamer, this one's electric and radioactive and about as close as science gets to sainthood. Now we shine a blinding beam on the life of Marie Curie, the Polish-born French-bred physicist and chemist who cracked open the atom, rewrote the laws of matter, and made history not once but twice. First woman to win a Nobel Prize. First person to win it twice. First to win in 2 different sciences. A queen of curiosity who wore no crown, just lab smock and an unshakable will. Born Maria Salameska on November 7, 1867 in Warsaw. She came into the world under Russian occupation where Polish identity was suppressed and education was a quiet rebellion. Her father was a physics and math teacher stripped of his teaching job for nationalist sympathies. Her mother was a head mistress, strict but intellectual. Tragedy struck early. Her eldest sister Zofia died of typhus and her mother of tuberculosis. By age 10, Marie had absorbed the cruel randomness of life. So she responded with control, determination, and a genius that refused to stay quiet. She was a prodigy, soaking up knowledge at an illegal girls' school while Russian soldiers patrolled the streets. Barred from university because she was a woman, she joined the Flying University, a secret network of underground education for women, equal parts academic haven and political resistance. She read textbooks in Polish and Russian by lamplight and taught herself advanced math. When her older sister Branna went to study medicine in Paris, Marie became a governess, supporting Branna financially while tutoring children and studying secretly at night. Finally, in 1891, aged 24, Marie left Poland for Paris. She enrolled at the Sorbonne, scraping by on bread and tea, living in a freezing attic and often fainting from hunger. But her intellect scorched through every barrier. She earned degrees in physics and mathematics, finishing first in her physics class and second in math. She also began researching magnetism. And then Pierre Curie was quiet, intense, brilliant. He admired Marie instantly, not just for her intellect, but for her stubborn clarity of purpose. He proposed marriage more than once. She initially refused, still unsure whether to return to Poland. But eventually she stayed. They married in 1895, skipping religious ceremony in favor of civil vows, and spent their honeymoon cycling through the French countryside. Romantic, perhaps, but also practical. They were building a partnership of equals, not a fairy tale. Their first child, Irene, was born in 1897. The same year Marie began her doctoral research. She was investigating the strange emissions of uranium recently discovered by Henri Becquerel. She noticed that a uranium compound pitch blend emitted more radiation than could be explained by its uranium content alone. That could mean only one thing. Another element was hiding in the mix. Actually, two. The Curies toiled in a dilapidated shed with no ventilation and barely any heat. They hauled wheelbarrows of pitch blend, ground it down, boiled it, filtered it. Took years. Tons of raw or yielded mere millig of result. In 1898, they announced the discovery of two new elements: polonium, named for Marie's homeland, and radium. Both were fantastically radioactive. Both would redefine science. Marie coined the term radioactivity herself, giving a name to the mysterious force that bent instruments and burned skin. Their findings were extraordinary, but the work was grueling. Radium glowed faintly in the dark. The Curies kept samples beside their beds and in their pockets, marveling at the silent, eerie light. It was beautiful. It was also deadly. In 1903, the Nobel Committee intended to recognize Henri Becquerel and Pierre Curie alone. But Pierre intervened, insisting that Marie be included. She became the first woman awarded a Nobel Prize in physics for work that was as much hers as his. The moment was historic and still somehow underplayed. 3 years later, tragedy struck. In April 1906, Pierre slipped on a rain-slick street and was crushed beneath a horse-drawn cart. Marie was shattered. She refused to attend public functions dressed in black for the rest of her life and buried her grief in science. The Sorbonne offered her Pierre's teaching post. She accepted, becoming the first female professor in its 650-year history. Marie threw herself into isolating pure radium. By 1910, she succeeded. The next year, she won a second Nobel, this time in chemistry, the first person ever to achieve that. But just as she basked in scientific triumph, the press turned savage. In 1911, journalists uncovered her affair with physicist Paul Langen, a former student of Pierre and a married man estranged from his wife. The French media, already suspicious of Curie's foreignness and fame, painted her as a home wrecker, a witch, an outsider. Mobs gathered outside her home. The Nobel Committee begged her to skip the award ceremony. She refused. The prize has been awarded for my discovery of radium and polonium. She wrote, I believe that there is no connection between my scientific work and the facts of private life. During World War I, she applied science to survival. Marie developed mobile X-ray units that brought diagnostic imaging to battlefields. She trained 150 women to operate them. With her daughter, Ira, at her side, she traveled to front lines using X-rays to locate bullets and shrapnel in wounded soldiers. Her machines were dubbed petite curies. She later raised funds to continue her research, traveling to the U.S. in 1921. American women recognizing a scientific sister raised money to buy her a single gram of radium worth over $100. 000 at the time. Curie, ever humble, accepted it not for personal use, but to advance public science. Her health predictably deteriorated. Years of exposure to radiation, handling it without gloves, breathing its dust, left her anemic and increasingly frail. She died on July 4, 1934 from aplastic anemia likely caused by radiation. But she didn't vanish. Her papers are still too radioactive to handle without protective gear. Her legacy runs in blood and lab notebooks. Her daughter Irene Golio-Curry, along with her husband Frederick, won the Nobel Prize in Chemistry in 1935. The year after Marie's death, Marie Curie didn't just change science. She changed who got to do it. She proved that a woman could pioneer, discover, teach, endure, and outshine an era that tried to silence her. No one gave her permission. She took space, and once she occupied it, she never gave it back. So here's to Marie Curie, physicist, chemist, mother, widow, rebel, pioneer, the woman who glowed in the dark and never backed down. Pierre Curie, the quiet force behind the radiance. All right, my luminous scholars, gather around again. We just lit the sky with Marie Curie. And now it's time to pay tribute to the man who matched her brilliance note fornity. Pierre Curie, physicist, pioneer of radioactivity, master of crystals and magnetism, and arguably the most feminist man in a century that didn't even have a word for it. While history sometimes frames him as Marie's sidekick, make no mistake, Pierre Curie was a giant in his own right. And the world of science glows a bit brighter because of his quiet, measured fire. Born on May 15, 1859 in Paris, Pierre Curie was the second son of Eugene Curie, a doctor with a taste for experimental science. The Curies were a middle-class family with strong academic leanings. Pierre's early education was conducted at home, which suited his quiet, introspective nature. He wasn't the sort of child who dazzled with charm. Instead, he was the kind who stared into crystals for hours and found symmetry more comforting than conversation. By the age of 14, Pierre had shown such proficiency in mathematics and physics that he enrolled at the Sorbonne. He completed his degree in physics by the time he was 18 and was soon assisting in research alongside his older brother, Jack. Together, the Curie brothers discovered piezoelectricity in 1880, the phenomenon where pressure on certain crystals produces an electric charge. This wasn't just some academic curiosity. It became the foundation for microphones, sonar equipment, medical imaging, and even quartz watches. If you've ever set an alarm or heard an ultrasound heartbeat, you owe the Curie brothers a nod. Pierre also worked extensively on the properties of magnetism. He developed what is now known as Kerr's law, which describes how materials lose their magnetism at a certain critical temperature, now called the Curie point. This work on magnetic susceptibility and phase transitions would later prove foundational for quantum mechanics and condensed matter physics. He was deeply respected by his peers for his analytical mind and methodological rigor. And yet he remained shy of the limelight, happy to teach and conduct experiments without fanfare. He might have remained an obscure academic figure were it not for a fateful meeting in 1894. That year he was introduced to a Polish student named Maria Skłodowska. She was studying physics at the SAN, standing out not only as a woman in a male-dominated field, but also as someone who radiated intelligence and purpose. Pierre was captivated. Their intellectual chemistry quickly turned into something stronger. They married in 1895, exchanging vows in a modest civil ceremony and skipping traditional trappings in favor of practicalities. Their shared dowry, 2 bicycles which they used to honeymoon through the French countryside. Their home life was unpretentious. No servants, no social posturing, just 2 scientists raising a family. Their first daughter, Irene, was born in 1897 and working side by side in a lab. In 1897, Marie began investigating uranium radiation inspired by recent work by Henri Becquerel. Pierre, absorbed in his own work on crystals and magnetism, gradually became drawn into her research. Together they discovered that the radioactive emissions were not dependent on the molecular structure of the compound but on the atom itself. This was radical. It meant that atoms were not immutable. Something was going on inside them. By 1898 they had discovered 2 new elements: polonium, named after Marie's homeland, and radium. Their methods were brutal by modern standards. They processed literal tons of pitch blende in a drafty shed at the School of Physics and Chemistry in Paris. The air was thick with fumes. Their hands cracked and bled from handling corrosive chemicals. They had no protective gear. Their notebooks would later be stored in lead-lined boxes for safety. But their determination never flagged. Pierre became fascinated by the effects of radioactivity on living tissues. He experimented by strapping tubes of radium to his arm, recording the burns and changes to his skin. This curiosity about biological effects was decades ahead of its time, laying groundwork for radiotherapy in cancer treatment. Still, he was well aware of the risks. In a rare moment of public warning, he cautioned against the blind commercial exploitation of radium, fearing what might happen if such power fell into untrained hands. In 1903, the Nobel Committee initially proposed awarding the Nobel Prize in Physics solely to Becquerel. Pierre, outraged, insisted that Marie's contributions were equal, if not greater. The committee relented, and for the first time a woman received the Nobel Prize. Pierre had used his influence not for self-arrangement but to make sure justice was done. That was his character. Quiet integrity, unwavering loyalty. They were not rich despite the fame. They refused to patent their radium extraction method, believing science belonged to the world. They lived modestly, never profiting from their discoveries. Pierre continued to lecture, research, and advocate for a scientific culture rooted in collaboration and humility. But the work took a toll. Pierre's health deteriorated. He suffered from fatigue, pain, and signs of what we now recognize as radiation poisoning. Yet, he kept going. He had recently been appointed to a professorship at the SAN and was building plans for a new laboratory. On April 19, 1906, everything stopped as Pierre crossed a rainy rue d'Ain in Paris. He slipped on a curb and was run over by a horse-drawn carriage. A wheel crushed his skull. He died instantly. He was 46 years old. The shock was immeasurable. Marie collapsed in grief. Their colleagues were devastated. Pierre's notebooks, unfinished experiments, and quiet presence were suddenly gone. But his legacy endured. His name lives on in Kerr's law, in the Curie point, in the Curie unit of radioactivity, and in every nuclear physics classroom on Earth. He also lives on in the philosophy of scientific humility and shared credit. Pierre never wanted fame. He wanted truth. And in Marie, he found not just a partner in life, but a co-explorer in the greatest scientific adventure of their era. So here's to Pierre Curie, the silent powerhouse, the crystallographer who dreamed of atoms, the physicist who opened doors and minds, and the man who helped split the atom without ever splitting his principles. Henri Becquerel, the accidental alchemist who found radiation in a desk drawer. Time to meet the man who cracked open the atom. Not with a bang, but with a bit of photographic film and a misunderstanding. Henri Becquerel, Nobel laureate in physics 1903, shared the prize with Pierre and Marie Curie, and though his name is often overshadowed by theirs, it was his spark of curiosity and a lucky mishap that lit the path to radioactivity. Let's give credit where it's due. Without Henri, there might have been no Curie revolution, no atomic science, and certainly no glowing rocks in laboratory coat pockets. Born on December 15, 1852 in Paris, Antoine Henri Becquerel came from a veritable dynasty of scientists. He was the third generation of a family steeped in the sciences. His grandfather, Antoine César Becquerel, had made critical contributions to electrochemistry and electrolysis. His father, Alexander Edmond Becquerel, was known for his investigations into solar energy and the phosphorescence of materials. In short, science was practically genetic. Henri grew up in a house filled with instruments, experiments, and a near-sacred reverence for inquiry. He followed the traditional path of elite French education. First the Louis Leron, then the École Polytechnique, followed by the École des ISOs. His early career was a balancing act between academic research and public engineering work. As an engineer, he worked on infrastructure projects. As a physicist, he immersed himself in optics, polarization, magnetism, and most fatefully the glowing mysteries of phosphorescent compounds. Phosphorescence wasn't just an intellectual curiosity for Henri. It was a family legacy and a subject he treated with near-spiritual precision. He inherited both his father's research notes and a passion for understanding how certain materials glowed after exposure to light. Henri devoted years to studying the absorption and emission of light in crystals. His academic career was stable, even prestigious. But it was the 1890s when things really started to glow. Literally. In 1895, the scientific world was shaken by Wilhelm Röntgen's discovery of X-rays. Invisible rays that could pass through flesh and reveal bones. It was the stuff of science fiction, and physicists everywhere scrambled to replicate or expand on the work. Becquerel was among them, drawn by the possibility that phosphorescent materials might also emit invisible rays. Could the glow of uranium salts be more than just a glow? Could it hold secrets beyond the visible spectrum? He devised a careful experiment. He wrapped photographic plates in thick black paper, placed uranium salts on top, and exposed the setup to sunlight, hypothesizing that the sunlight would charge the phosphorescent, which in turn might emit rays similar to X-rays. But then came the twist. A bout of gloomy weather. Paris fell into a stretch of cloudy days. Henri, unable to conduct his sunlight-powered experiment, tucked the setup into a drawer. He intended to return when the skies cleared. But curiosity got the better of him. He developed the photographic plates anyway, and what he saw changed science forever. Clear silhouettes where the uranium salts had lain despite no exposure to sunlight. That moment, that accidental development, marked the discovery of radioactivity. He was astonished. Whatever was fogging the plates wasn't phosphorescence induced by sunlight. It was something intrinsic to the uranium itself. A spontaneous emission of energy. He had found a natural self-sustaining phenomenon. He called the emissions Becquerel rays. But the term would evolve. Marie Curie would later coin the word radioactivity. Henri published rapidly. He showed that the intensity of the radiation correlated with the amount of uranium regardless of the compound's composition. This meant that the radiation came from the uranium atom itself. It was a radical notion. The atom, long thought to be the smallest indivisible unit of matter, was in fact breakable, and when it broke, it released energy. This turned the classical view of matter on its head. If atoms were not immutable, then physics had been looking at the world through a cracked lens for centuries. Becquerel had not just found a new kind of ray. He'd exposed the instability of matter itself. In essence, he had cracked open the atom without knowing it. But Becquerel, ever modest, did not proclaim a revolution. He quietly continued his experiments. He documented that these rays could ionize air and affect photographic film, and that they penetrated certain substances while being absorbed by others. He remained meticulous, methodical, cautious. He was not one to rush into sensational claims. Meanwhile, Pierre and Marie Curie took the baton. Inspired by Becquerel's findings, they began their own investigations, ultimately discovering polonium and radium. The trio would become the founding figures of nuclear science. But Henry never competed with the Curies. He encouraged them, admired them. In fact, he had a quiet camaraderie with Pierre, grounded in mutual respect for precise, rigorous inquiry. In 1903, the Nobel Committee acknowledged his discovery with the Nobel Prize in Physics shared with the Curies. The award citation praised his discovery of spontaneous radioactivity, recognizing that he had identified a completely new natural phenomenon. The Curies expanded on it, but it was Becquerel who opened the door. After the Nobel, Becquerel returned to other research areas, particularly the interaction between matter and magnetic fields. He became a professor at the Museum National d'Israël and maintained his position as a respected academic voice. He was also awarded the Rumford Medal, the Helmholtz Medal, and election to various learned societies. But the effects of his work and his exposure to radioactive substances were taking a toll. In later years, he suffered from recurring illnesses and strange skin lesions believed by many to be symptoms of radiation damage. He died in Laquasique on August 25, 1908, at age 55. The official cause was not made public. But his death fits the pattern of early radiation researchers who paid dearly for their discoveries. Today, the Becquerel, the SI unit for measuring radioactivity, bears his name. 1 becquerel equals 1 atomic disintegration per second. A humbling, powerful reminder that even the smallest units of matter are humming with energy and change. Every physicist working on radiation today, every nuclear reactor, every radiotherapy machine owes a nod to the man who followed his curiosity into a draw. So here's to Henri Becquerel, the man who made light from the dark, who cracked open the boundaries of matter with quiet brilliance, and who showed that sometimes the biggest revolutions come from the smallest, most accidental beginnings.